Hi everyone, this is Annie Santacoy, and this week we are going to learn about psychological biases. So we've talked about critical thinking and critical reading in last week's module, and we've mentioned it a lot when we talked about education. If you remember, we say that a person usually has to be taught to think critically. People may develop the skill all on their own, but first they need to be made aware of certain things, such as the power of language, logical fallacies, what makes a good or a bad argument, and cognitive biases. Part of the reason that critical thinking can be difficult is the fact that we all have cognitive biases. E.O. Wilson, a famous sociobiologist and writer, once said, "The human mind is an instrument of survival that employs both reason and emotion." This means that as people, we live and make decisions based on logical thinking and based on our personal feelings, which may or may not have any logical basis. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. We need our emotions to live. We can react quickly with our emotions. If our ancestors took the time to think through every decision instead of reacting quickly based on fear and suspicion, they would most likely have died to predators. That said, our biases are often tied up in our emotions. That said, that reliance on our emotions and quick decision making has kind of led to biases. Wilson also said that the mind is a kaleidoscopically shifting map of others inside the group and a few outside, each of whom is evaluated emotionally in shades of trust, love, hatred, suspicion, admiration, envy, and sociability. This means that we're constantly viewing and judging others through the lens of our own emotions. So what exactly are biases? Biases are natural tendencies in the human brain, which are adaptive, but they can also lead to errors in judgment. They're adaptive because we use them to make quick decisions, but they're not always logical. They don't always make sense. Those errors in judgment are often barriers to good critical thinking, and learning about them will be especially important in our future discussions when we talk about the book and conspiracy theories, political rhetoric, and science. So now I'm just going to take you through a list of all the different types of biases. First, let's look at biases about ourselves. Egocentrism. We're all a little bit guilty of this. It's the tendency to see the world as centered on yourself. It's the tendency to see yourself as better than average, and so it leads to the self-serving bias, which is the tendency to take credit for successes and to blame failure on the situation. So the self-serving bias is when you want to take credit for all the good things and you want to blame all the bad things on everyone else. And an example of egocentrism maybe is when you just can't understand why people don't think the same way that you do, because obviously the way that you think is the best way. And this sounds so obviously self-centered, but we all do this, and a lot of the time we just don't realize it. So it's really important to recognize these biases and to understand that they do affect your decisions. So the next one is the optimistic bias. It is when we assume that we are more likely to experience good outcomes and less likely to experience bad outcomes. Now we see this a lot in the book, in Educated. The father of Tara often puts the family into really dangerous situations because he really thinks that bad things, really bad things, are just not going to happen. Like taking out the seatbelts in the car and just assuming or believing that nobody will die if they get into a car accident. And his thinking is that bad things happen to other people. Bad things happen to sinners, but not him, not his family, because he's righteous, right? But that's a bias. So the next bias is the false uniqueness bias, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's similar to egocentrism. It's when you think that you're better than others and you're above the norm. It sounds bad, but it's not necessarily. we all want to think that we're special, right? We all want to think that we're kinder than others, more noble, stronger. It could be something as small and simple as that. And next we have the choice supportive bias, which is the kind of thinking that if you chose it, it's a good decision because you're good, so it's fine, right? This bias usually happens after you've made a decision, and it's whenever you try to justify to yourself that that decision was the best decision, even if there's a strong argument against it. So, for example, let's say somebody wants to buy a house, but they're on a really tight budget. And they go ahead and they buy a house that's a bit over their budget because they just fell in love with it. Now that they already bought the house, now that they've already made that decision, they're telling themselves all of the good reasons, like, well, I mean, this house is in a great location and I just really connected with it. And they're just telling themselves all the good reasons, and they're ignoring all the reasons that maybe they should have waited or maybe they shouldn't have bought the house. It's when you're just kind of reassuring yourself of a decision that you already made. The next one is the overconfidence bias. This is when you just think that you'll be fine, don't worry about it. It's related to the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is when it's the less you know about something, the more confident you tend to be about it, and the opposite is true as well. One example might be, let's say that your friends are going on this really challenging mountain climbing trip, and they invite you along. Well, you've never been mountain climbing before, but you decide to tag along anyway, because how hard could it be? So you don't know very much about it, so you think you'll be fine, when the reality could be that it's very dangerous. And finally, the last bias about ourselves is the blind spot bias, which is when you fail to recognize your own bias as a bias. Alright, next we're going to talk about our biases about others. We have a bias about authority. We tend to trust and listen to people we believe are authorities. This could be your doctor or the government. This is one that can help us, and it's powered by normative and informational social influence. We want to be liked, and we want to be right, so we conform. We conform to what we believe the authorities or the leaders want. And this relates to the group bias, which is kind of like egocentrism, but applied to a group that you belong to. Thinking that your family or that your country is the best could be a group bias, for example. Now we also tend to generalize. Group attribution error is the belief that characteristics of an individual in a group are reflective of the group as a whole. This is kind of like stereotyping, but backwards. So, for example, say you think that one Santakoi is crazy, so the whole Santakoi clan must be nuts, right? Fundamental attribution error is the tendency to overestimate the internal causes of others' behavior while ignoring situational causes. It happens when we put blame on people because of their imagined personalities or because we think that they made a completely free choice, but we don't consider the situation that may have affected their choice. So it's basically assuming the worst about people based on an event. It happens a lot to political figures, for example. Next we have biases about information. The negativity bias is a greater sensitivity to negative information. We see the bad more than we see the good in things. Confirmation bias is the tendency to look for information that confirms what we already believe and ignore disconfirming information. So everyone experiences this. We all want to be right, so we find ways to prove it even if we don't know that we're doing it. Conservation bias is when you assume that prior evidence is better than new evidence. This is why people are often suspicious of new evidence. For example, did you grow up eating margarine instead of real butter? For a while there, the medical community and everybody believed that butter was terrible for you. So many of our parents, my parents for sure, bought butter substitutes like I can't believe it's not butter, or I don't know. But now that we know that butter is okay in moderation and that margarine can be bad for you if you eat too much, um, my parents still buy margarine because of confirmation bias. They still think that butter is worse for you. They just don't want to change their thinking. Information bias is when you assume that more information is always better than less. It's continuing to search for more info even when you don't need to, even when you have enough to make a decision. The ostrich effect is the tendency to ignore dangerous or negative information. It's really scary, so you don't want to think about it. You'll see this a lot later in the book, Educated. I won't spoil a whole lot for you, but when Tara's parents, they don't want to come to terms with something, and it affects their thinking and their argument because it's so scary to think about that they just ignore it. And because they do that, it hurts people. So the outcome bias is whenever you think that something's the right decision because everything turned out well. So it's a bias that also happens after the fact, kind of like the choice supportive bias when you think that you made the right choice after you've already decided. This is pretty much the same thing, but it could also be based on a situation. So something turned out well, so everything that led up to it must be good, right? Even if what happened that made everything turned out well was pure chance, or maybe the things leading up to that good event actually didn't cause the good event. But because of this bias, we often think that it does. The anchoring bias is our over-reliance on the first piece of information that we see. This happens a lot with prices. For example, say you go into a car dealership and you obviously want to buy a car, and you find one that you like and you go to discuss the prices and they want to sell it to you for $25,000. And you're not sure whether you want to pay that, so you negotiate a little bit, and they say, okay, well, we'll sell it to you for $20,000. Now, because of the first price, the first piece of information was $25,000, now you're prone to think that $20,000 is cheap. Well, what if at another dealership, what if the car is actually only worth $17,000? But because you were told that it was worth $25,000 at first, that's stuck in your mind, so anything below that you're going to view as cheap. The availability heuristic, or the availability bias, is our tendency to make calculations or make decisions based on how quickly examples come to mind. So it's a mental shortcut. It's made to help us decide really quickly based on previous experiences or, more likely, things that we've heard or seen. But a lot of the time, just because we immediately think of these examples, it doesn't necessarily justify our decision. So, for example, airplane crashes. Everybody can picture them pretty clearly in their mind. We all have heard about and seen disasters on the news where airplanes have crashed. But the reality is that airplane travel is one of the safest methods of travel. But say somebody is deciding whether or not to fly or to drive to a destination, and they decide to drive because they're thinking about all of these airplane crashes. But the reality is that driving would be more dangerous. So if they're avoiding flying because they think that it will be more dangerous, that's illogical. But because that person has this bias, they choose to drive instead. The curse of knowledge is when you think that since you know it, you assume that obviously everyone else knows it. But that's not true. That's not always true. This bias comes into play a lot whenever you're talking to somebody and you just assume that they know what you're talking about. Or you're making an argument and you just assume that they understand what you're talking about. But that's not true. The wishful thinking bias is exactly what it sounds like. It's thinking that something is true or not true because you want it to be true or because you don't want it to be true. And this is a sneaky one. It seems really obvious, and we can a lot of the time see it in other people, but whenever we're experiencing the wishful thinking bias, it's not so obvious. It's very easy to sort of trick yourself in this way. So last of all, we have biases about the world. The naturalistic fallacy happens when you think that something is good because it is natural. People often idealize nature or living like our ancient ancestors, but that isn't always logical for whatever circumstance. For example, the paleo diet, a lot of people go into it or get into it because they think that eating like ancient humans is probably better for them. And I'm not knocking the paleo diet. I'm sure it's good for you. I'm just saying that that kind of thinking isn't necessarily logical. The same thing happens a lot in like skincare or food. For example, for a while there was like this craze with like lemon face wash and stuff, and there were videos circulating on YouTube that said that all you needed to treat acne was lemon juice. Just put lemon juice and honey on your face. Well, that's really bad for you. Do not put straight lemon juice on your face. That's not even close to medicine. But a lot of people tried it and probably hurt themselves a little bit because they thought that, well, it's this natural fruit. It must be good for my skin. Next we have magical thinking, which is the belief in the interconnectedness of all things through unseen forces. It manifests in interpreting closely occurring events through causality. So thinking that two things that happen close together are related or that one caused the other, and thinking that it's kind of magical. Like, for example, maybe you threw a coin into a well and you made a wish, and then the next day you win $1 million and you think, oh, it was the coin in the well that did it. Well, no, probably it was just chance, but that's magical thinking. Patternicity is finding meaningful patterns in random noise. It's kind of related to magical thinking. So finding patterns when there just really aren't any patterns. The gambler's fallacy is a really good example of it. It's whenever gamblers think that they've lost so many times that odds are the next time that they bet, they have to win. Like the big winnings are coming because of this pattern. Or a lot of time, gamblers will see patterns in the numbers that appear in lotteries or card games. So this is also related with agenticity, which is the tendency to infuse patterns with intent and agency. So one example of this might be conspiracy theories. A lot of the time people will make connections where there really just aren't any connections, and then they attribute those connections to a secret underground organization or an evil famous person, when the reality is that there just isn't that pattern, there isn't that connection, and there isn't that intent or agency, which means there's no person or organization behind it. But a lot of the time, even when we hear all the evidence against what we see as a clear, meaningful pattern, we still want to believe in that clear, meaningful pattern because it just seems so obvious to us. It must be true. But that's it for biases. I know it was kind of a long list, and I hope it wasn't too confusing. And I hope that as you guys watch this video, you can think of a few examples of your own of biases that maybe you recognize just out in the world, in yourself, in friends. Not necessarily bad, just things that don't quite make sense. And if we can learn to recognize those more and more often, we'll be the better for it. Alright, do your readings, try to spot these biases, and reach out to me or Daniel Poole if you have any questions. Bye!